have to wait for the...
Tell us when you're going to start.
We're on.
You're on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. You asked for a little bit of family history from some of us that are a little bit older. And so we're going to try to oblige. And I'm going to tell the story as I know it, since you gave me some time to think about it, in one principal story and then a couple of side vignettes. It starts in 1895. And that year, roughly that year, my maternal grandfather, Antonio Tartaglione, or Tartaglione, and his brother, Miguel Tartaglione, came to the United States. Now, my parents never told me that my grandfather had been in the United States. I found this out when I visited Italy in 1976, and my cousin, Agostino Renzi, mentioned that our grandfather had been here in the 1890s. He obviously didn't like it here. He went back to Italy after only a short while. He either had been married or he got married, and he and his wife had 2 daughters, the younger of whom was my mother. The older daughter, whose name I can't remember, she later married, my mother was born in 1900. Her older sister married a man named Loreto Renzi and had 3 sons, Antonio Renzi, Agostino Renzi, and Miguel Renzi. When I visited in 1976, all 4 of them were alive. None of them are here now. I think, Evie, you meant Agostino and Miguel when you and John were there. But all of them are gone now. My mother was born in 1900, and like I said, my uncle Miguel stayed in the United States. Okay, my father was born in 1893. He was one of 5 siblings. I think the oldest brother, I think he was the youngest brother. I think the oldest brother was Carmelo. And when I visited Italy in 1976, I met one of his sons, and who I suspect is no longer alive. There was another brother named Pasquale. Pasquale came to the United States and settled in settled in Philadelphia. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. And there was a brother, Antonio, who married and had 3 sons, Giambattista, same as my brother's name, Eduardo, and Miguel. When I was there in '76, I met Giambattista. Eduardo was out of town. Evie, I think you met probably all 3 of them. The two Eduardo and Giambattista are now dead. I don't know about Miguel. And then in addition to my brother, there was a baby sister, Assunta. And I'm going to come back to Assunta in one of the vignettes. Okay. My father, 1914, the war breaks out. He's, I guess, 21 years old at that time. He either joins or is drafted in the Italian army, becomes a member of the Italian cavalry. If you've ever seen his tombstone, you'll see a picture on there of him very proudly in his army uniform. He goes into war against the Austrians, and he gets captured. I guess he's held prisoner until the end of the war, and then he's released. He and my mother are married in 1920. They have, after a year or two, they have a daughter. I guess her name was Emily or Amelia, and at the age of 1 or 2 or 3, she contracts a childhood disease and dies. Okay, now I'm going to go back, leave that alone. I'm going to go back to Miguel. He's in the United States. He's living in Glassboro. The reason he's important, he's the primary reason the family ended up in Glassboro. I think he marries. God bless you. What's your contribution? I think he marries Frank Biello's mother. I'm not sure of this, but I vaguely remember hearing about this. Frank Biello, Jeffrey, would be Mary Biello Raffa's grandmother. Frank Biello was her father. He marries, my uncle, great uncle marries her grandmother. I don't think the marriage went well. I don't know if she died or they broke up, whatever.
She was mean.
But that explains the reason why the Biellos and he built that. Some of you kids will remember that mausoleum out in the middle of the St. Bridget's Cemetery, the gray chapel.
You should remember it, Don.
You should remember
Don't
that.
you remember
Yeah.
it, John?
It was right in the middle of the cemetery. It wasn't a mausoleum in the sense that the bodies are buried above ground. The bodies are above ground, but there's this little chapel above it, and the graves are subterranean. And sometime around the 70s, I can't remember, the damn place was going to fall down, and we had to pay to get it knocked down and covered over. But that's why they built together. Miguel is buried there. I think he died sometime in the late 40s. But the key point is that during the early 20th century, whatever he did for a living, I suspect he was nothing more than a laborer. He acquired like 5 different properties. He acquired the lot that John and Evie built their house on. He acquired 301 Ellis Street, where Jeff and Heather lived. He acquired 217 Ellis Street. He also had a house on the other side of the railroad track on Ellis Street. And he had a lot, the 5th property was a lot roughly across the street from St. Bridget's Cemetery. So he had those 5 properties. So going back to Italy, my sister dies. I guess my parents have to decide what do they do with the rest of their lives. He's got a brother in Italy. She's got an uncle in the United States. He's got an uncle a brother in Philadelphia. She's got an uncle in Glassboro, and he's got some cousins around in the United States. So they decide to come to the United States. He comes to the United States, I think, approximately in 1925, and I assume goes and lives with my mother's uncle in Glassboro. I'm not absolutely sure of that. She eventually comes to the United States sometime, I think, around 1928. I think they live in Glassboro. My brother is born not much more than 9 months after she arrives in the United States. He's born in Philadelphia, Federal Street. I don't know why. I don't know if you know, but my guess is that my mother spoke 0 English. She had either a relative, a distant relative, or a friend who was a physician in Philadelphia, Dr. Teodoro Cianfrani. Remember Theodore?
Yeah.
And I met him once in the 50s. He spoke perfect English, perfect Italian, and they may have gone up and lived with my Uncle Pat while she was waiting John's birth. But in any case, John was born in 1929 on Federal Street in Philadelphia, and I assume after the birth, the family moved back to Glassboro. That's the, I mean, you know, I came along 7 years later, 1936. At that point, my Uncle Pat had died in 1932. So going to Philadelphia, I assume that when my mother gave birth to John, they went up and stayed with Uncle Pat, but I'm not absolutely sure of that. But he died in 32. By the time I came along, that option wasn't available anymore anyway. But in addition, I think by that time, Ralph Ventura had established a practice in Glassboro, so there was an Italian-speaking physician in the town. I once asked John, I said, do you remember Uncle Pasquale? And he said he had this vague recollection of, on weekends, he would come down from Philadelphia, because my brother was only 3 when he died. And he and my father would walk to the station, which was only about a block away from the house, and there was frequent train service at that time. And Uncle Pat would take him by the hand, and they would walk back to the house. So he had this very vague recollection of our uncle.
That's your mom's brother?
No, that was my father's brother, Pasquale.
Oh, okay.
My mother's uncle lives until, first of all, he deeds 5 properties to my parents, which is how they acquired the properties. And he lives, Evie, I can't remember, he died before you married or after. Do you remember? He died either in the late 40s or very early 50s. It's a Miguel.
Oh. I knew him.
Yeah.
It must have been probably either before we got married.
Yeah.
Because I don't think he was around when we got married.
I don't think he was either. I think he died in the late 40s.
But I knew him.
So that's the main story. Let me see if I can remember what the vignettes were. Well, one is my father's kid sister, Assunta. She marries a swashbuckler. Did I pronounce that correctly? Named Cosmo Shawley. Cigars, Uncle Gus.
God, yeah, Uncle Gus.
And
Remember him?
and she comes. They have a daughter, Louise, in 1920, I think in Italy. But very shortly after that, they come to the United States. And I vaguely remember being told that they lived at 217 Ellis Street for a while. Now, I'm not sure of that. But then my father's sister gets ill, fatally ill, fairly quickly. And she tells Gus that I want to go back to Italy, I want to die in Italy with my mother. So Gus picks her up and takes her and Louise, the baby, the daughter, back to Italy. And she dies. Gus leaves them there and comes back to the United States. I remember Louise telling me that that sometime around the late 20s, my mother was still in Italy. That some woman came to my mother and said, "Tell your husband to tell your brother-in-law, Gus, to come and get his daughter because she's not being treated well." So he went back to Italy, and now by this time, he was very quick on remarrying, because he was widowed twice. He went back to Italy, picked up Louise and brought her here. And at that point, he might have been married to Aunt Mamie. You remember Aunt Mamie?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't.
No, you don't know.
You don't.
Mamie wasn't in the corner house one?
No.
Oh, sorry, wrong Mamie. There was a Mamie there.
That's the second vignette.
Okay.
That's the second vignette. Thanks for reminding me.
Okay.
So, comes to the United States, and Gus goes and gets her, brings her back to the United States, and where am I? Louise is still alive. She's 90 years old. She lives in Belmar, New Jersey. She's really the only first son.
She's still around?
Yeah. No. And she eventually marries a tailor named Dominic Severino.
He's the guy that got me my engagement ring.
Okay, you're right.
Took me to Philadelphia.
Yeah. And
That little room.
That little room in where Diamond Row is, right there.
They have 3 children: Suzanne, Susan, Rose, and Anthony. And then they split up, and he remarries and has some children by his other wife. She eventually remarries but is widowed again, and she's still alive and, like I said, living in Belmar. Saw her, what, 5 years ago, Hannah? Last time? So that's one vignette. The second vignette is, in addition to the other relatives I've already mentioned, there was another Silvestri family in Glassboro. They lived at the corner of what was then Railroad Avenue and Ellis Street, which is now Oakwood Avenue and Ellis Street. And except they called themselves Silvester. Now, I never knew what the relationship was, but Satch's daughter tracked it down. Apparently, the old man there was my father's first cousin, even though he was like 20 years older than, almost 20 years older than my father. There were 5 daughters and 1 son, but given the age difference, they were closer to my parents' age than they were to my age or my brother's age. 5 daughters, Mamie, you mentioned, Christine, Millie, Monica, Albie Desiderio.
Right.
So the Desiderios are sort of distant cousins, and Mary Pareca.
Oh,
Right.
Pareca, Charlie Johnson, all those, they're kind of very distant cousins. Now, the key part of this story is there's one son named Frank. Now, Frank is a very hard-working, entrepreneurial guy. Now, he uses the name Silvester, but the family name is Silvestri, because if you go out in the cemetery and you look at the gravestone where the parents are buried, it says Silvestri. In fact, I did a double take once when I went by, because it didn't say Antonio Silvestri, it said Anthony Silvestri. I said, I'm not there. I'm still here. But in any case, but I don't know whether it was an Ellis Island bloop or whether they anglicized it intentionally, but they used the name Silvester. My brother was very close to Frank.
That's where John got Silvester.
My brother was very close to Frank. I worked for Frank, I think, when Frank had a news agency. Frank was Geets. Geet, and he eventually started Geets' Diner. But before that, he had a news agency. John liked Silvester, so he started using Silvester, and my big brother could use Silvester. I started using Silvester, and my father really got pissed off at both of us for not using
Did you use Silvester?
until I got out of high school, yes. High school, I made sure that, no, in high school I made sure the diploma was Silvestri, and then I used Silvester.
No,
I
so
think you
John
lasted until you got out,
Till
you got out
John,
of the
till I
service.
had John. When I had John's, when I said we
But
have to
that's,
have it right.
but that's where the Sylvester came from for I'm done. Yeah?
It still goes on, people call me that,
Call you what?
Sylvester, mid-show.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, see, your Uncle John went through military, he went through school, everything was Sylvester. But what he told me, he said, was your mom was very, very sick when he was little. And therefore, he was practically raised by the Sylvesters on the corner.
Spent a lot of
Spent
time
a lot of
there.
time there. So therefore, he took their name. Sylvester.
Wow.
Yeah, and nobody changed it, you know, or anything like that. So he went through the military, went through high school, everything. And then when John was born, I said to him, John, we have to put the right name on the birth certificate.
I think that's so funny.
And then we changed our
I
name.
think I'm gonna change my name.
Yeah, we changed our name.
Okay, cut. Because
No.
Yeah, that's it.
Questions?
Anybody have questions for Lucy?
What?
I'm sure people have questions.
Okay.
Fine.
So your Silvestri family relatives that remain in Italy, there are still some, correct?
I'm sure there are quite a few, but none that I'm any longer in contact with.
But you visited some of them in the 70s, right?
I did, yes.
And they were in Naples, and they were
No,
Silvestri.
No.
my cousin Augustino was in Rome. The Silvestri family was mostly in Montreduni. And yeah, and there was Silvestri. The Sylvester was strictly an invention down the street in Glassboro.
Yeah, an anglicized Americanism thing.
Whether they did it purposely or whether it was an Ellis Island thing, I don't know. Where's Nick? Nick's here. I mean, his grandmother's family name was Greco. His grandfather, great-grandfather, Nick Cracker, because when whoever the original Greco came through Ellis Island, the guy heard Greco and he wrote down Cracker.
That's not your own cracker. Yeah.
Half the time it's cracker, half the time it's crocker.
Yeah. So, my story is reasonably accurate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell about the story about his grandfather and the dog.
No, that's nothing to do with this, Jen.
Now, the Assunta that's in Italy,
The what?
Assunta.
She was Augustino's widow. Augustino
Okay.
Renzi's widow.
Okay.
Yeah, we got to visit.
No, I remember her.
The first time we went to Italy with Daddy, Augustino was alive.
Yes. All right.
We hadn't gone.
I never saw him.
No,
He was the painter.
yes.
Yes, not bad.
Pretty
Yeah.
painter.
Excellent artist.
How
I'll
long-
never forget, he gave me a beautiful picture to take home when I took it all the way home from Italy, on
Yeah,
the
I have one,
airplane
I have
and
one.
all.
That was
Huge.
embarrassing. They
It
took
was
it off
like
their
this.
landing of their
They
house.
did, they took it off of their
They
wall.
started
gave
wrapping
to
it
us.
up and gave it to Mom
It
to
was
bring
beautiful.
home.
So how did you guys end up with the flower shop?
Who us? Well, John, we were married in 49. We were married 4 years before. John had to go into the service. He had to go into Korea. Well, when we got out of high school, he was a sign painter. He was too young to get a job. He was only 17. So when he became 18, he got a job at DuPont's, and he went to work there for a couple of years. Then he had to go to the Korean War, and he was in there for 2 years. And when he came out, he and, well, you don't know Uncle Paul, but Paul Lisa, a friend of his, a good friend that he grew up with, they bought a feed store in Glasgow. So they had the feed store, and it was all right for a couple of years. And then after that, it started to go downhill. So they turned it into a garden store. And that didn't do so good. So then,
A feed store for like livestock and stuff? Oh.
yeah, the chicken, oh, he worked hard, they worked hard.
How about
They
the
used
chicken
to-
coops, Mom?
Chicken, thousands, they grew thousands of chickens, and sometimes they would get sick and they'd have to go and give them a pill. Every chicken they would have to give an injection with a pill, you know, how much they did. And then he says, we laughed because he had this one time, they got this kind of flu or something, and he said he walked into the chicken coop and they would go, whoop, fall and die. Shot to make them bigger and get more meat on them, you know? Oh, it didn't work. Once they got sick. Oh. Anyway, he did a lot of crazy things. But he was always trying to make money. Oh, he was.
Bunnies,
He was
bunnies,
really a worker. He was-
Bunnies? You really tried to raise
Oh,
rabbits?
we tried to raise, we
Rabbits?
were married, mind you, and we lived with my mother, and he had angora cages out the side of the garage. He was trying to raise angora rabbits to shear the thing off of the fur and send it away to make money. He raised bees. We had bees. He did everything.
Beehives?
Anything
So
to try to
honey,
make some
you
money.
did that.
Well, anyway, after he came out of the service, and his Paul and Tootsie, she worked in a flower shop, and the two boys were in business, and we sat down, all four of us, and we said, well, we've got to do something, because we're not making any money, we're just losing money. So she said, you know what? She said, how about if we open up a flower shop? And we sat there and talked about it, and we said, okay, we'll try. You know, young, crazy. I mean, you don't even know what you're doing. And we did. We opened up a flower shop.
And that was what year?
Oh, gosh, that was...
About.
He got out of the service in 52, 54. So that must have been like maybe 55. And we had it for 32 years. And it was the only shop in Glasgow.
And
All
John
those
was already
years.
born, right? John, you were. You
Wasn't
born
the
in
shop
53.
62? Didn't you
What?
turn it into a flower shop in 62? You retired in '94, right?
No,
uh,
retired in 90.
90.
It was the only flower shop allowed to decorate at Holly Bush during the,
Yeah.
during the,
Summit.
Summit.
You wanna,
That was a thrill.
yeah.
you guys wanna, because I'm not sure, I mean, younger than us, that anybody knows what that is.
What?
The summit.
The summit.
Oh, that's when Kosegin and Johnson, right?
Yeah, they
Met.
met at Glassboro,
Mhm.
Glassboro
Holly
State
Bush.
College.
Holly Bush.
Yeah.
During the height of the Cold War.
The president's residence at Glassboro College.
That was a thrill. And then we were notified that they would like us to make the flowers for the banquet tables. And we sent them, I remember, 2 dozen roses. Yellow roses to Kosegin and 2 dozen red roses to Johnson as a gift from us. And then we made all their centerpieces. And when the boys delivered the flowers, they checked them all out and
Searched,
make sure
right?
the flowers and all, you know, to make sure nothing was in it and all. And it was a thrill. It really
It's
was.
on the front page
Wow.
of
Yeah.
the, front page of the New York
It
Times.
was really, and then we got a thank you from the president. So it
Wow.
was nice. It was really nice. It's a lot of hard work, but
So,
You-
what is it?
Your mother died in 1956. How long was she sick?
My mother,
Yeah.
a very short time. She had appendicitis, had an appendectomy, and they didn't get her up in time, and she threw a pulmonary embolism. She was ill probably less than 2 weeks. You
Right.
remember? Something
Oh,
like that?
sure, I remember. Gosh,
Yeah.
Donna was only 3 weeks old,
Right.
and she was so happy that we had Donna.
Yeah.
Oh, she was so thrilled. So thrilled. I was so glad she did get to see Donna. Well, she had lost her daughter, you
Yeah.
know, and I
Yeah.
mean, she had had boys, so it was a thrill for her to have granddaughter.
so tell us a little more about John. I'm sorry,
Who, John?
Yeah,
No.
No, I'm John.
Oh, our
Husband John, brother John.
Well, I'll start.
Okay.
John.
He was always there for me.
That's a great thing.
I flunked first grade.
You did?
I got a
John
PhD
stayed
when
back
I got a PhD when I was 25, but I flunked first grade. I'm serious.
Tell me
And-
why.
Well, I was sick a lot.
Mhm.
I used to tell people, I didn't speak English very well, but that was a bunch of crap. But and my father was terribly embarrassed by this. Okay, this kid flunked first grade. So, but he doesn't speak English well enough to go talk to the teacher. So he sends my brother, who must be all of 12 years old, maybe 13, to go negotiate with Miss Winterberg to see
Oh, I remember Miss
you remember her?
Winterberg.
To see if he can if she'll pass me the second grade. No go. He tried his best, but she insisted that I repeat first grade. You can pick it up.
Well, he told me that when he started school, he didn't speak a word of English. He
Yeah,
had to
Daddy?
learn- Daddy.
Daddy.
He had to learn in school. He was really smart.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was a
Very, very
smart
smart.
fellow. He really was.
Yeah, we
He
grew up.
obviously ran in the family.
He grew up in that Italian ghetto. We grew up in that Italian ghetto. I mean, my mother was illiterate,
Oh.
and I don't know, she was. I mean, tell the
Yeah,
truth.
but-
And she didn't ever really learn to speak
No,
English.
she didn't.
No, I mean, she died in 1956 when she was 56. She was in the United States close to 30 years. Lived in that Italian ghetto on the west side of Glassboro, where you really didn't have to learn how to speak.
Right.
Yeah, because everybody spoke Italian, right?
Sorry?
Everybody spoke Italian.
Yes, yes.
But she was a nice lady, very nice lady.
Did they face much discrimination?
Some.
Yeah.
But we were fairly powerful.
There were
I
a
mean, in
lot
a
of
sense, there were a
Italians.
lot of us.
A lot of Italians.
And, St. Anthony was a fairly strong political group. So a lot of people catered to us because of that. I don't you think?
Yeah, I
I
think.
mean, there was
I think so.
discrimination, no question about it, but there were enough of us that It wasn't too bad.
What was growing up in Glassboro in the 40s and 50s like
Nice.
during the war?
During the war, I have a story for you during the war. Do you remember that supermarket on the corner of High Street and Main? It burned down during the war?
Yeah,
Remember
the
that?
junior mechanics hall.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I used to
There's a
sing
supermarket.
upstairs.
Now, things are
You
rational.
slept upstairs?
Sing.
Sang.
Oh, I thought you
used
said
to
I
learn
used
to
to
beat,
sing.
and they used to have a big hall up over top of the drugstore.
Whoa.
Lutz's drugstore used to be on the corner. And they would have the Acme. It was
I don't know what it was. It was a
It's an Acme.
supermarket of some, it's where the gas station is.
American
is now,
store, we
yeah.
used to call it the American store.
Huh? Yeah. So everybody's, all the kids are saying, hey, you know, everything in there, you can walk away with it. Nobody cares. I mean, the stuff's no good. So I went there with my little red wagon. And I loaded it up with foods of various kinds and soap and whatever was on the shelves. And the police chief arrested me. He confiscated my little red wagon. My poor father was embarrassed to tell again. He had to go
Your
downtown.
dad all the time.
He had to go down and, no, not that much. He had to go down and pick up the red wagon and take it home. That was my first memory of the war. Then I remember, my first recollection of the war itself was when we took Okinawa and when we dropped the atomic bomb on
Yes.
Japan and VJ Day. Those things I remember, and the celebrations for VJ Day I remember. So,
But that's where your prison record started.
yeah, that was it.
Your life of crime.
That's funny.
Well, I remember as a kid, of course, I had it very hard. My father was always sick.
Yeah.
And my mother, of course, we had 4 kids then, and then my brother died when he was 17. But I can remember as like maybe 8, 9 years old, I guess I was. I can remember, do you remember back in the firehouse, there used to be all these ashes, these big hills of ashes in back of the old firehouse.
Yeah, I remember the old firehouse, I remember.
Yeah, and they used to hand out food, like potatoes and flour and sugar.
Yeah.
And I remember as a little girl going up there and waiting in line to get the food because we had it hard, very, very hard when we were growing up. Because my dad was always sick. And then when the war came, that's when he really got a job. He got a job in the Navy Yard. But
Shipyard or the Navy Yard?
Navy Yard in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And but he didn't last long. Then he got very sick and he died in 46.
What did you die?
Diabetes, really.
Died. No, it was
Phlebitis, right?
phlebitis.
Oh, all right.
Phlebitis.
He was what, 50?
54.
54.
But I think when we were growing up, everybody was in the same boat, so you didn't feel any different. You know what I mean? Everybody was poor, everybody knew. But everybody was still happy. I mean, it's not that you were, but everybody lived the same because there weren't too many jobs around. Your father was lucky because he had a good job, really, Anthony.
Sakami.
Right.
What did you and Uncle John do for fun?
For fun?
Yeah. Dad.
You talking to me?
Oh,
Yes.
you mean him?
Yes. I'm sorry. I don't want to know what did you guys do for fun?
You're asking me what we did for fun? Well, I'll tell you, I got 3 kids.
I knew the answer. Yeah, the answer.
That's the best line of the night.
Well, I know your Uncle John said he was got in a lot of trouble, didn't he? He told me he used to, one time they tried to smoke or something in back of Digivani's and they started a fire.
Yeah.
And he just,
That's where you get it from.
I forget what he told me they used. straw or something. They tried to make cigarettes. He and Kingy, remember
Okay,
Kingy?
sure.
Okay, and he said he used to go down to we used to have the railroad track, and the railroad used to go always, there were trains going back then, there were trains always on the track. And they used to jump the freight cars. Can you imagine?
No.
Little like that. It was
How old
maybe-
was he?
I guess maybe he was about 8 or 9 or something like that.
Just a
Anthony.
baby.
Yeah.
He would jump the freight trains, he said. There would- Like he and Albert Miatico, you know little Albert Miatico, and a big pile of, he was, I think, a little on, he was little.
The kids in those days used to work in the summertime on the farms.
Oh, he was a good farm
And
worker.
he was one of the fastest bean pickers
Pickers.
around. He was so fast
They called
that
him
his
Beans.
nickname was Johnny Beans.
Johnny Beans. He
And-
did.
And
He was
then
a
I
great-
got the name, even though I didn't deserve it, Little Beans. Because I wasn't very good at picking beans. I didn't last too many summers on the farm. I started working in the shoemaker
He
shop.
really worked on the
So,
farm.
but he was very good at it. So, and he was, you know, he always wanted to play. He was a very good athlete. He always wanted to play football. But my father, absolutely not. Under no circumstances would he sign the approval for my brother to play football. And he, so John was also an excellent basketball player. And he told my father, if you don't sign for me to play basketball, I'm going to drop out of school. And I guess my father talked to some people to find out what the hell basketball was all about. And he signed it, and John became quite a star
He was captain of the
basketball
team, he
player
did.
at Glasgow High School. And somebody said to my father, hey, you know, your son's really a good basketball player. You ought to go see him play. To my father, that
He didn't know what it was.
he didn't know what
He didn't
basketball
know.
was. I mean, it was. And I'm sure he never.
Sports.
I don't think he ever went to see him.
No.
So.
So Evelyn, how did you meet John?
I went to school with him.
So
High school.
High
High
school.
school.
Excuse me?
Grade school.
Grade
Grade
school,
school,
high
all
school.
through school.
So you knew him all throughout school?
Yeah, and he always told me that when we were in 6th grade, he sent me a Valentine, and I tore it up. He always told me that. He said, and you tore it up. And this was in 6th grade. And then we never really started to go together, I guess, till we were like in sophomore in high school. We didn't go together. I mean, you know, I'd see him at school, and he would walk me home. And we walked, we had no cars. And if we went to the movie theater, we'd have to go on a bus. We'd go to Camden on a bus to see a movie. This was like when I was a junior or senior, you know?
When Camden was nice.
And Canada was a big deal
Yeah,
there.
it was beautiful there. But then we started to go together, and I'll never forget, he was a good basketball player. And the coach really, really liked him.
Rudowski
No,
and someone
it was
else.
that little Italian guy.
Esposito?
Yes, Esposito. He wanted him to go to college, really wanted him to go, on a basketball thing. And John didn't want to go. He wouldn't go. And I know I got blamed for it. The coach thought it was because he was going with me.
You wanted John to go to college?
He wanted
and play
John to go to
scholarship.
college, yeah, I remember that.
Did you go to his basketball games?
Did I? No.
What did you?
I
did?
saw some of them, but not all. I didn't.
Uncle Anthony, did you go to his
Not
basketball?
that I remember.
Yeah.
I was sat on the bench and I just saw him going
No, I saw their yearbook. He was the captain.
He was the captain of his
He's a lot
team.
younger though.
Now,
Yeah, right.
even Grandpa, when John played, didn't they hide him playing?
When John played.
When John played at Eustis, didn't they hide him playing from
John
Grandpa?
was, Grandpa, I'm not sure, John, when did you play at Eustis?
It would have been 68 to 71.
Okay, he was still alive.
Yeah, he died in 73, right?
No, he died in 70.
70.
Yeah.
Didn't you break an arm at one point playing?
That was
Your wrist.
69.
Right.
Your wrist.
Isn't that I seem to vaguely recall the story of him getting hurt and him hiding it from him.
It could be.
Well, we probably didn't tell
Yeah.
him, yeah, because he'd be mad, he'd holler at you. John.
Now you know where
Big
we
John.
get it from.
Oh, I don't know.
So we get it from?
Don't call your father.
So, Mom,
Yes,
when did you get engaged? When did you and John get engaged? How old were you?
I was, well, we got married when we were 20. We
20.
got married in September of 49, and I was 20 that February, and John wasn't even, he wasn't even 20. In fact, Pop had to sign for him to get married,
Ah,
so we were really young.
you were a little older than me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
months.
Same with
Few
my
a few
mom and
months,
dad. Yeah.
about 3-4 months.
The pictures in your house, right? Did you get married at 301 Ellis Street?
No, we were married at St. Bridget's.
No,
St. Bridget's, but did you?
But we went over to your house to have breakfast, right?
Just had breakfast.
Yeah.
They had a
Okay.
reception in a real
So
place.
you were pretty
Yeah.
young, Uncle Anthony, when they got married. You were just
I
a
was
Yeah, he was
14,
little.
so
little teenager.
13.
You were younger than that.
13.
Were you 13?
I'm 7 years younger than John,
Yeah.
so I was.
There's a picture in the dining room of where they had the breakfast.
That was like breakfast.
And he's in
After we
there,
got
and
married.
of course Aunt Evie's in there, and Uncle Paul's in the picture.
And
The
Tootsie.
Same table, the
Louis.
pictures hanging in the corner of the same room that the picture was taken, 1949, the same furniture's
love
in the room.
that.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
nothing's
that's
changed.
great.
Yeah.
Daniel, Uncle Anthony, how did you meet? At Penn State?
Halloween party.
Internet.
What were you dressed up as?
Huh?
What were you dressed up as?
No, we weren't in costume. It was a party when, oh my God, 58? Yeah, Halloween 58.
And I got dragged there. I had a date with someone else that night. And I didn't want to go to this party. So I accepted for you. You have to go. And I met him, but I didn't like him.
I've had that effect on a lot of people. Yeah.
So when did you start liking him, Ann?
About 2 months or so.
Oh, it took a while.
Yeah.
Was
I
he
thought He was
persistent?
okay, yes. I thought he was okay. I had just come in from student teaching for the weekend, and I was coming back the following weekend to stay. And my girlfriend was invited to this party and accepted for me, not even asking me. And I said, but I have a date with this friend of mine. She said, no. And I went out with her and met him.
When was the first time you went to Glassboro?
We were engaged, right?
I
No,
don't remember.
no.
No, you had to stay with John and Evan.
Yeah, Labor Day weekend, the year
A lot different back
before we got
then.
married. Yeah, I wasn't allowed to go out anywhere with him, but only because I stayed at their house was I allowed to go. And Donna fell out of bed. I slept in her bed, and she slept in John's room on a twin bed, and she fell out of bed. I've loved her ever since.
And you guys got engaged?
Easter Sunday.
Easter 1960.
And so how old were you? You were in college. You were at Penn State when you got
Yeah,
engaged?
I was 24, she was 21.
Oh, you went after the younger one.
Well, he was a grad student. He couldn't help it. That's all there were younger women, right?
Well, mostly.
And you got married 3 months later?
After
4 months later?
August.
we knew each other a year and a half.
Yeah, but it's, I guess a little different. You pull the wedding together quicker then.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't a grandiose wedding. It was just a nice wedding. About 120 people. It was just it was nice.
Not gonna be so easy on you, Joe.
It wasn't like they have them today.
Oh, God, no.
I'd rather have the way it was when I got married. I'm sorry. It was
Now-
simpler.
Now, you said if we were to ask you a question about the history of Christmas in the Silvestri family, it would be a 7-second conversation.
There wasn't any.
There wasn't anything.
No. I mean, I don't remember a Christmas tree. I never remember a wreath.
You're kidding.
There would be, when I was a little kid, there would be a little present by the back window in the pantry. Is that what it is, Jeff? That was it.
First time John had a tree was when he came to our house, when he started to come with me.
The first time he had a
Came out
tree
with
was
me,
when I married
because we
him.
had a tree, my mother had a tree.
I put one up on three.
And was that because Grandpa just didn't believe in that, or
Well, I
just
mean, he
didn't
was
do that?
religious, he was fairly religious.
Just,
But I
And
mean, he
believed
just,
and certainly believed in the religious aspects, but none of the, what do you wanna call it, the showiness of the trees or wreaths.
That's not a big thing in Italy, is it? The whole Christmas tree thing isn't a big thing in
you know,
Italy.
I really don't
I
know.
don't either.
I really don't know.
Not as much as it is here.
I don't,
so.
I really don't
Probably not.
think so. I don't know. I don't know whether they have, I imagine now they would have Christmas trees.
Dad's been trying to carry on that tradition ever since, no Christmas tree.
He still doesn't want a tree.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
What do we call him?
Scrooge.
That explains some of it. But you never knew why. Well, you never knew anything different.
I never knew anything.
I mean, if you walked around town, did everybody else have Christmas trees, or?
No,
Oh,
sure.
I don't know, I think you would know.
I know my house, we always had a Christmas tree.
I
Well, did
guess,
you
The real one
celebrate
or that little
Christmas
one that
together
Grandma
when these guys were all little? Did you
What,
celebrate
what,
Christmas?
what'd you
Did you
say?
celebrate Christmas together when the cousins were little?
well, we weren't living,
Oh, you were?
we were living up in Bucks County.
We
Oh.
were only there 2 years.
We were only in Glasgow for 2 years. Jeff hadn't been born yet, Joe was just an infant. And then we moved to the Yardley area in Morrisville, stayed there until 1980, so.
In 1980, we started celebrating together.
Okay. That's a 30-year tradition.
Well, we always had Christmas and holidays together.
With the
With our
Cordettis,
family.
yeah, with the Cordettis
Yeah.
stuff, but the Silvestri thing
No.
didn't start till 1980.
Or later, I don't know.
Maybe, when we moved out. Because the other family was getting married and expanding and all that. I think that was the reason. Excuse me, I have to move.
Okay.
So,
Anybody got anything?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Well,
That's
thank
great,
you. That was
thank you.
wonderful.
Wasn't hard, was it?
no,